In 2023, Australia faced a recession on a per capita basis for only the third time in 40 years, signaling a significant economic downturn. What did this mean for Australians? The effects were immediate and profound. Wages plummeted, reaching levels last seen in June 2011. This decline occurred despite various crises over the years, including devastating bushfires and the COVID-19 pandemic. But when Australians were asked what issue impacted them the most, one answer resounded above all: the cost of living. Over recent decades, Australia has experienced one of the most dramatic housing booms in the world. Since 1973, housing prices across its capital cities have skyrocketed by an astonishing 36-fold. Sydney, now one of the world's least affordable cities, ranks as the second most expensive place to live globally. How did Australia reach this point? This is the complex, often unseen reality of life in Australia. Chapter 1. Housing and Rental Crisis. Australia, a breathtakingly beautiful nation surrounded by oceans, offers world-class beaches, vibrant cities, and expansive parks. A place that seems like paradise. But for those who dream of living here, the reality is far from idyllic. For example, to afford a median home in Melbourne, a family must earn at least $170,000 annually. In Sydney, that figure leaps to $260,000, while the median household income in these cities hovers around $100,000. It becomes apparent that for many Australians, especially young families, homeownership has drifted far out of reach. While some argue this issue is isolated to Sydney and Melbourne, the data tells a different story. Since 2020, home prices in other cities like Brisbane, Adelaide, and Perth have surged by over 50%, with wages only growing by about 12% in the same period. Young Australians, in particular, face an uphill battle, having missed out on the earlier periods of home value growth, leaving them constantly playing catch-up. The outcome? Homeownership among Australians under 34 has declined by nearly 25%. The housing crisis in Australia is perhaps best illustrated by an example from Sydney, where a property lacking basic amenities, no toilet, no power, no kitchen, ignited a fierce bidding war and ultimately sold for $3.5 million. For those who choose to rent instead, the outlook isn't much better. Finding an affordable rental property is exceedingly difficult. Median rents in Sydney now exceed $3,000 monthly, with Brisbane following closely at around $2,500. Historically, Australian rental prices rose at manageable rates, but since 2020, annual rent hikes have spiked by over 8%. Today, renters are caught in an impossible situation: 2024's rental prices with wages that barely mirror those of 2011. And as demand for rental properties soars, prospective tenants find themselves competing against dozens, sometimes hundreds, of others, just for a place to live. Open houses are packed with lines stretching down city blocks. Renters are no longer competing for luxuries, they're simply seeking a place to call home. The aspiration to work hard and afford a comfortable life seems to be slipping further from reach for honest, hard-working Australians, leaving many feeling powerless. It begs the question: what has driven Australia's real estate market into such disarray? Chapter 2. Immigration. Many point to immigration as a potential culprit behind Australia's housing issues. Recently, the government acknowledged that Australia's migration system is broken and in need of sweeping reforms. In the fiscal year 2022-2023, Australia saw a record-breaking 740,000 new arrivals, a figure 200,000 above pre-COVID levels. This surge translates to a simple economic principle: more demand against limited housing supply leads to higher prices. Analysts and economists largely agree that immigration has had its biggest impact on the rental market. A majority of newcomers hold temporary visas, and approximately 70% of them are renters. The effects are particularly noticeable in migrant-heavy suburbs. For instance, Melbourne's southeastern areas and Sydney's inner southwest both saw rental rates jump by 18% in just 1 year. Immigrants, often willing to share accommodations to stretch their budgets, intensify competition for rental units, indirectly outbidding local Australians. When it comes to home prices, however, the argument that immigration is the primary driver becomes less convincing. In reality, Australia's migration rate has actually declined over the past decade and remains within historical norms. The real issue lies in the disconnect between population growth and housing starts, as construction has not kept pace with immigration over the years. Chapter 3. Not building enough homes. Australia's construction industry finds itself in a challenging cycle. With building costs rising yet again in 2023, only 170,000 dwellings were completed, the lowest figure in a decade. Simultaneously, Australia experienced one of its highest immigration surges in recent memory. Since 1966, the ratio of homes built relative to Australia's population has steadily declined. The trend worsened significantly around the year 2000, creating a supply shortage that continues to affect the market today. Cultural preferences play a role as well. Australia's suburban lifestyle is one where sprawling single-family homes are the norm, not urban high-rises. For example, Sydney and Melbourne each have roughly 2,000 people per square kilometre, starkly contrasted with cities like London at 6,000, Munich at 4,400, and Amsterdam at 3,600. These figures reveal that Australian cities are among the least densely populated in the developed world. Theoretically, Australia has ample land to expand its cities outward, with Sydney alone capable of adding 280,000 homes in its greenfield areas. However, Australia's NIMBY, not in my backyard, mentality complicates matters. Although facing an acute housing crisis, Australia recorded its lowest level of detached home approvals in over a decade in March 2024. Community resistance combined with government red tape often delays housing projects significantly. For instance, obtaining approval for a single home development in New South Wales takes an average of 111 days. In Liverpool, it can take as long as 288 days. Compare that to Texas, where approvals are often granted in less than a week. Chapter 4. Tax incentives, negative gearing, supers, and capital gains. In an attempt to address housing shortages, Australia introduced negative gearing in the 1930s, allowing investors to offset rental property losses against their personal income. Under this system, if an investor loses $10,000 on a rental property, they can deduct that amount from their taxable income. Only New Zealand and Japan share this policy among OECD countries. In the 1980s, the government attempted to restrict these deductions, but backlash quickly restored the original provisions. Coupled with the removal of interest rate controls, negative gearing has made it financially advantageous to acquire debt-financed properties. Further tax incentives exist through Australia's retirement accounts, or supers, which enable Australians to hold real estate investments within these accounts at significantly lower tax rates. In 1999, capital gains tax on real estate was halved, with even further reductions when property is held in a super. Few countries have such generous tax incentives for property investors, making Australia an attractive environment for real estate speculation. Chapter 5. Declining productivity and investment. Australia's tax system incentivizes investment in real estate over more productive sectors, leading to a gradual decline in overall productivity growth. Between 2010 and 2020, annual labor productivity increased by only 1.1%, well below previous decades. Australian R&D spending as a percentage of GDP is 1.7%, lagging behind the OECD average of 2.4%. The outcome? A stagnation of real GDP per capita over the past 10 years, with living costs rising while wages remain stagnant. Corporate and individual income tax rates are higher than the OECD average, yet revenue generated from real estate remains disproportionately low. Chapter 6. The solution and conclusion. The complexities of Australia's housing crisis transcend political party lines. Although many may place the blame on specific governments, the problem has endured across decades. Under Paul Keating's Labor Party, Australia saw modest housing price increases alongside economic growth. John Howard's era, however, marked the most substantial rise in housing prices in modern history, with prices more than doubling. And each successive government, Labor or coalition, has overseen further increases, only slowing during the global financial crisis. The solution requires multifaceted reforms. Encouraging business investment, reducing income taxes, abolishing negative gearing, removing red tape, and holding politicians accountable are all vital steps. Australia's housing crisis cannot be resolved through half measures or short-term fixes. The real solution lies with policymakers and citizens alike, using policy to drive meaningful change. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth economic and financial analysis.